We moved to Colorado in 1994, and the year before that I took my first hand quilting lesson, and this is the quilt, this sampler, which is about a crib-sized quilt, is the first one I made. That's when I realized that making quilts wasn't cheap. But it was fun, it was creative, and it filled a need that most people have to be able to be creative in some direction. I just didn't realize how far that direction would go. And this is my quilt room, and I spend lots of time in here. This quilt is one that I happened to see in a picture in a quilt shop, and they happened to have some of the fabric that was in it of the birds in the frames they had, and so I was able to come home with that and buy some of the other fabric that went with it when I went with the birds and put it together. It's called three-dimensional butterflies because the little butterflies that stand out are three-dimensional in that they are only tacked on. They are not appliqued completely. So they are free. Yeah. They are free. This is an old quilt. It's probably the first block of the month that I did, and it is the one I traditionally put up at Christmas and sometimes into January or February when we lived in Colorado. It was probably done somewhere around the late 1990s, 97, 98, because I don't have a date on it or that, but that's about when I remember having done that. This is a rather interesting quilt in that I started this quilt when I was 18, and I like to do cross stitch, and this was a cross stitch quilt, and so I did the pieces and I put them together, and then I didn't know what to do with it, so it just stayed there. And one year Dave gave it to me completely quilted on Mother's Day, and that would have been in 1964.
Yeah, I remember that quilt was on your bed the whole time I was growing up.
It was on the bed, on our bed in Minnesota. Yes. Then I saw it was starting to wear out. So that was a quilt that I made at the request of Melissa, and it was a first run quilt in that when I ordered it I got a reply from the designer that said I was the first one to buy the quilt. And I do believe that was in about 2008.
Okay. Anything else on that one?
No. That quilt is called A Drunkard's Path, and I probably did that around I have a blank. Probably 2007 or 8.
So it was in the log house in Colorado?
Yes, that's the carpeting in the log house.
Oh, yeah.
That one, I don't remember who it went to, but it was done about the same time as the other one, 2008, and I do not have it now. It was called 6 Halves Make a Whole.
What does that refer to?
There were 6 half yards to make the quilt.
Okay.
That is a convergence quilt that I made for Tim. And that was for Christmas in 2011. And I made, this is the loons, and I made one for Peter that had elk on it. So
Okay.
that is a self-designed quilt that I made for a lady that we met in the island of St. Lucia. Her name was Letty, and she wanted something bright, and she wanted flowers. And that was in 2010.
Okay. So it looks like a lap quilt.
Yes, it's just a lap quilt. That was a shop hop quilt done probably around 2005 or 6, and I think that Corey has that now, but I'm not positive.
So are the applique columbine on that, are those part of the original pattern?
Yep, they were part of the original pattern. And of course I chose that layout because it had turquoise in the background.
Mm-hmm.
That's a convergence quilt that Philip got at Christmas time in 2011. That was a shop hop quilt about 2009, and because of the cat, I thought maybe they would like it, which they did very much.
Oh yes.
And that one is 2004, and it was what was called a first Saturday quilt. In other words, you bought the first square for $8, and all the rest of the squares for 9 months were free if you had it finished by the next month. But any of the extra things had to be bought separately.
And that was kind of our housewarming quilt.
It was, yes. That was also a block of the month quilt that I made, and I believe Carla Jones has it now. Or do you have it?
No, this is the one that's on the guest bed in our house.
Yes, it is. That's the one that was given to you, and it was probably it might have been a shop hop quilt, but maybe around 2005.
Okay.
That is a convergence quilt. It was also a wedding quilt that went to Amanda Jones and her wedding this year in 2012. That is a Mountain Peak quilt, and it has used the Colorado Remembrance fabric. So the square in the middle actually says, "Welcome to Colorful Colorado," and it has a few things that are reminiscent of Colorado over the years, like the bighorn sheep are the state animal, and of course the skiing and snowboarding and the miners there, and a few other things that are very well known for the state, in the state. That is also a Mountain Peak quilt that I made for Corinne and Tim this year for Christmas, which was 2012.
The butterfly.
Yes, it has butterflies. Not known to me, Corey's grandmother had just died, and she loved butterflies, so she was very happy with that, and she also likes purple, so it made a big hit. This is a quilt that I made shortly after we moved to Colorado, which was in '94, and that was a friendship quilt, sort of, in that everybody made one square, and that one square we made enough for everybody, and I think there were maybe 10 people in our group about that time.
So you had to make one particular square 10 times?
Yes, and I made the one that's right in the middle on the top, which was a quilt shop.
Yeah. Okay. And we have that at our house.
Mm-hmm. That is one of my favorite quilts, probably because of the colors, etc. And it was called something like a 7-piece quilt or something similar, 6-piece, but it is also hand quilted. I took the time to hand quilt that, which I don't normally do. And that one has a very unusual name in that I made it while we were in San Diego taking care of Philip's cats. So I think that was, and it was this year, 2012, and I believe it's called a cat sitting quilt, because that's what we were doing. That is an attic windows quilt, and it's just a garden scene, and I would have made that in 2009 or 2010, because it was a class I took just before we moved to Arizona. That is a friendship quilt. The Bailey Patchers each made a square for me, and my square happened to be the one in the bottom of the middle square, and it was, maybe 2008 that we did that, but everybody in the group, because I made a star, they almost all made stars also. But it turned out very nice, and it's an original design.
So they got to see your star first and then used that as their...
They got my star in a box, and that box was passed around, and I didn't get to see any of them until they were all finished.
Wow.
So then it was a decision on how to put them together. And if there were a couple I didn't like, I couldn't exclude them. I had to put them somewhere. And it went together quite well. That was my first convergence quilt, and I took a class in 2010 for that, and it's iris on it, and it turned out very well, but I have made several since then because it's an easy quilt to make. That is a quilt that I finished shortly after we moved here, and it was the last shop hop quilt that I had in Colorado, and that has the Colorado Remembrance fabric in it, and it will be in the Palo Verde Patchers quilt show this year. Or, no, next year, in February of 2013.
How does it get chosen for that?
I just entered it.
Okay.
That is the back of the One Block Wonder quilt. That's the One Block Wonder quilt, and appliques, and it's called Cabin in the Woods. There are two of these quilts, and they are twin bed quilts that I made shortly after we moved to Colorado, because we had twin beds upstairs in the loft, and probably in 1995. One year when I was out shopping, this was a quilt that was stated a quick Christmas quilt. So that, in other words, to give to somebody if you want, and it did go together very well.
I don't think we wrote that one down.
I guess not. Anyway, it was probably, I was in Colorado, so it was probably in the early
2000s.
2000s.
Okay.
That's a yellow brick road, and the yellow brick road was done in 2002, and it was, at that time, I just thought the colors on it were the best of my colors, and I did it. It was an easy quilt to do, and I still have it. This was the 2012 Shop Hop material in Colorado this year, and I happened to be in Colorado a week after this Shop Hop, but I was still able to get the fabric. But it is an original design, and it has the wildflowers of Colorado on it. This was called a mystery quilt. You only got one portion of the directions at one time, and so for 4 months you got different directions. And I know that I finished this in San Diego cat sitting in 2011. This was a class I took in Bailey from one of the quilt members, and it has some very nice oriental fabrics in it that are bright and attractive, and I do use it from time to time in different places. This was also a first, we call a first Saturday quilt, and it was a sequel to Cabin in the Woods. Anyway, it was called, I think, Rocky Mountain Wildflowers in the middle, all the applique, which was a lot. It was tedious, and yet it's one of my favorite quilts. It looks very, very nice when it's hung on the wall for everyone to see.
Mm-hmm.
That was 2009. Oh, this quilt is called Colorful Colorado. Those sun pieces on the top with the spiky things that look like rays, I think, were paper piece, which I absolutely hate doing. But it came out as a very pretty quilt, and very Colorado type. And
did you say, I think that one was
2007. That's Mexican Stars, and it's also sometimes called Mexican Wedding Quilt. I made that in 2012, after having it on my shelf ready to make for at least 4 or 5 years. This is called Stars Over Colorado, and it was a shop hop quilt in Colorado, Denver area, and that was done in 2009, and I like the colors on it very much. It's very striking. This was called a stack and wet quilt, and I did that, oh,
I think that might have been one of the last ones I wrote down on there, so it's back towards the back.
was with the Cocapelli.
Yeah, there it is. It's
yeah, I see
there.
it.
Okay.
The border on it is the print that I started out with, and it made those different kinds of stars, and that was done in 2002. This particular quilt is rather interesting because the center piece was bought in Amsterdam when we were there on a river cruise. And it's my own design. I had all the fabric right here in the house to pick out and put together. And I put it together very quickly because 2 of the people on the boat went to the quilt shop, and they actually brought the center one back for me, and because I couldn't go on the public transportation. And so I thought I really had to finish it before I got back to San Diego to show them I appreciated what they did. And it has turned out really pretty well. So that's a 2012 quilt. This is one of my favorite quilts also. It is a Jenny Beyer design, and I didn't really know what I was doing until I got through, so I would have done some things a little differently, and it was done in 2008. That is the quilt we have on our bed in the summertime, and it is called Chevron Daisies, and it was done in 2007.
It's one of my favorites.
Hmm?
That's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I like the colors on that too. This is a quilt that I took a whole year to make. I did 1 block a month purely because of the intensity of the work in it. And it's the pottery representing the different Indian tribes in New Mexico.
That's one of the last ones I wrote down, so it'll be like on page 4 or 5.
And it's just called Southwest Pottery, and it was done and finished in 2010. That is the quilt that we have on our bed in the winter time. It is a friendship quilt in that in the beginning I made Morning Glories, and it was an applique square. And I included in enough of the light blue squares, I think they were 11-inch that I included, so that I could cut them down if necessary, and asked people to use that piece of material someplace in the square. So it's rather interesting that they were all used as a background, and I didn't care if they were pieced, if they were machine embroidered, appliqued, but most of them were appliqued, and then to round it out I made 4 more. So I made 5 of the squares, but the people in the Bailey Patchers made all the rest, and it's an original design that I put together. This is a king-size quilt that I made in 2012 for Philip and Béla, and it was a very interesting piece to put together. And looking at it in the picture, I can see that I have one end that's light and one end that's dark, which I never saw when I was doing it.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't noticed that either. And this had a name.
It was called Counterpoint, and those are all Oriental fabrics. Oh, this is just a little wall hanging that I got the pictures in a panel in some little town in Nevada, and happened to pick up some of the other material, and so it also is an original design, and I would have made that in
This one didn't have any information on it.
It didn't have.
It didn't have a label on the back.
Okay, well, I think I finished it about the time we moved here, so 2010. This is a baby quilt that I made for a friend in St. Lucia when she had a little boy. And the story behind it is rather interesting in that I sent the quilt in May of 2012. She did not get it until August of that year because it got hung up in customs. And when she got it, she was just thrilled because the baby that was born in June was named Noah.